Hey, what's up, internet? I figured we should get a video together about the patch notes that came out yesterday. If you were with me on Twitch, we watched the live stream together, and then we went over the patch notes. They released them right after the stream again, just like they did in 3.16, which was very cool of them. And we learned a bunch of things that are pretty relevant. Figured I'd give myself a day to kind of stew over them and try to pick out the most important ones, because obviously we don't want to go read through all the patch notes yet again, but there is a bunch of stuff that is relevant, both Freezing Pulse and Siege Ballista. So I would say the first important thing is the new support gem, Eternal Blessing. So this Eternal Blessing jewel, you can buy this in Act 4 after defeating Malachi now. And it's basically a replacement for the old Mortal Conviction keystone, which was right behind Blood Magic. It allows you to basically turn on an aura, even though you are Blood Magic, but it restricted you to one aura. And so what they've done is they've taken that out and they replaced it with this support gem, and it says supported aura skills lose their reservations and become blessings. Only be able to benefit from one blessing at a time, and while under the effect of a supported skill, all non-blessing skills which reserve mana are disabled. So this means one of two things. One, we would be able to use this on top of an Essence Worm and get 2 auras without reserving any mana, because Essence Worm would make the aura we have in that ring also cost no mana. Or if we activate this, it's possible that every other regular aura that would reserve mana, whether it's in an Essence Worm or not, becomes disabled because it's technically a skill which would reserve mana. You know, whether Essence Worm is making it 0 or not. I think that's how it'll actually work, because this is sort of replacing the Mortal Conviction keystone, and you wouldn't be able to use an Essence Worm with Mortal Conviction. And I suspect they'll keep that, but we'll have to check. I think at a minimum, Freezing Pulse totems will use this over an Essence Worm, even if we have to choose, because the ring slot should be more valuable than what we can do with 2 sockets. Obviously, when PoE comes out, it'll be a little bit easier to test that stuff. But there should be a lot more options in rings that present value compared to what we can. A couple of gems. One of the other big changes here, obviously, is the Atlas. So if you missed the live stream, you should definitely come check out this pathofexile.com/siege and look at some of the new stuff. The largest element of the expansion, for sure, just like with Ritual, is the Atlas. The entire Atlas is changing. We have 4 new bosses that are basically beyond Maven. And then the core Atlas itself is just very different. As you can see, we start at the bottom now instead of the center, and we work upwards. And as you can kind of tell, we have like a more classic style of Atlas. If you remember the Atlas of Worlds, basically anytime before the Conquerors showed up, there was like a fixed tier of a map, right? And you could upgrade it with the old Shaper's Orbs, but yeah, you know, there are white, yellow, and red maps in the base Atlas. You don't use Watchstones to upgrade the Atlas anymore. You are going to be able to use these Void Stones kind of like Watchstones. You'll put your Sextants on these, and you will socket them down here. This is how you'll be able to upgrade the lower tier maps upward. But they aren't necessary to have tier 16s anymore. Like, you'll just be able to work your way up here to tier 16s without any Watchstones or killing any bosses. I personally like this change a lot. I think the Watchstone system, I like the idea of having more control, like being able to have press towards the tier 16s you wanted first, or being able to have everything tier 16. But I really think it wound up being overly complicated for a lot of people. Like, if you explain the Watchstone system to like 10 people, maybe like 2 or 3 of them actually understand it the first time. It's a really annoying system, and it felt a little bit grindy. This feels like a little bit more straightforward, right? You're going to get to the Atlas of Worlds, and then it's just going to be time to run your maps. And if you haven't run a map yet, you will want to run it to get the bonus. because the other big change to the Atlas is instead of having those region-specific skill trees, there is now an entire gigantic Atlas passive tree, just like the one we have for characters. The biggest, aspect of that being that all of these will apply to the whole Atlas. There's no longer like having to run up in the top right specifically, or like running top left alleyways specifically to find harvests or something like that. You're going to be able to choose what kind of bonuses you want on your Atlas and then run anything you want. This is obviously humongous power creep, by the way. Like, this is for sure the biggest part of the, just like with Ritual, adding the Atlas skill trees in the first place and making everybody want to map like crazy. You're going to be able to pick all this stuff, and then just go run whatever you want. But you're going to be able to pack it all into one map, right? And that's pretty important. Like, if you think about being able to target farm like Harvest, Ritual, Syndicate, and Heist all at the same time, maybe on the map of your choosing, so you don't have to think about what region it is. There are no regions anymore. To that end, it's kind of useful to know which maps are leaving. The some of the most farmed maps are getting taken out, but there's still some really good targets. Like Burial Chambers came back, which is an obvious one because of the Doctor card, and Cemetery's still there. Cemetery was probably my most farmed map. Tropical Island is leaving, so that one's not really an option. City Square is worth mentioning too. City Square is not very mob dense, and so if you're trying to farm for quantity or you are farming for experience, probably not your target. But if you're specifically farming league mechanics like Syndicate, Legion, things like that, City Square is really hard to beat. It is a tiny map, and the boss and most of the league mechanics are right in the middle of it. You just go from the start to the middle. It's the same exact layout every time. So if you're just trying to speed farm league mechanics, this was probably what I would do a lot. They also, make the Orb of Unmaking drop everywhere. It'll be a lot more common because they're basically going to be regret orbs now, but for your Atlas. And you now have like 12 favorite slots, I think, for favoriting maps. So if you use all of your favorites on the same map, it's something like 120 times the drop rate, they said, compared to everything else. So it's basically, more than 99 times out of 100, I guess, it should be rolling that map, assuming it's not being like tier blocked or something. This is kind of crazy. You're really going to be able to target farm a map now, basically. Now, the one thing that has changed that I'm not sure people will be crazy about, but I think is probably the right idea, is that Sextants have been kind of pushed out towards the end of Atlas progression and is not part of the core progression, because this is now part of the core progression, right? You get an Atlas skill point every time you clear a map for the first time. So the old Atlas bonus that improved your map drop rate is now giving you these skill points, and I'm sure that some of these travel nodes and stuff, the travel nodes are almost certainly things that increase your map drop rate, right? But this is sort of the main progression now. If you go from one map to 117 or whatever's on the Atlas now. So Sextants, you can't use them without Void Stones, and Void Stones are kind of like the new Watchstones, but you only get them from endgame bosses. So there's 4 to collect. I think they said it was Shaper, Elder, Maven, and Sirus. Maybe I'm mistaken. I think those are the 4 bosses that you can get those from. And they work kind of like the old Watchstones in that you socket them, and they will upgrade the tier of maps. But since we already have some tier 16s, they basically work, from the second highest tier backwards. So your first one is going to upgrade everything below tier 16 by 2 or 3 tiers. Then you can have a full tier 16 Atlas again once you've killed all 4 of those bosses at least. But you can't use Sextants at all until you have one. This is still where you put Sextants. They also deleted two of the Sextant types. There's only one. Well, there's I think it's Awakened Sextants, the regular one, And then the ones that still drop from Maven, which are like super buffed ones. But I think, people just use. This is definitely like the meat and potatoes, just like it was with Ritual. I'm really looking forward to this. I think it's just going to be a lot of fun to have much more straightforward, also more powerful, more customizable progression. That's what kept me around in Ritual for so long. Like, looking forward to it again. As part of that, one of the other changes, Sirus and the Conquerors, since they're sort of going into itemized content, they're not being deleted, but just like with Shaper and Elder, they're going to have their own maps now. And like the Conqueror maps will drop fragments that once you have 04, you can open a portal to the Awaken or 8 version of Sirus. So because of that, they moved Awaken gems from the Conqueror content and Sirus to the Invitations and the Maven content. So Maven can drop all the old ones that Sirus could only drop, and then her Invitations can drop like the regular ones that could have dropped from the Conquerors. I don't mind this. I think some people will probably complain about this, but I certainly would rather do it, do it in the Maven content, which seems a lot easier to me, having to fight any of the Conquerors again. Speaking of Conquerors and influence stuff, the other like main change to the game is going to be these Eldritch implicit modifiers. Because the Conquerors are sort of going into their own itemized maps, there has to be sort of a new itemization element of influence that's part of the core Atlas, and that's this stuff, where they drop these sort of little, I don't know, tumor looking things, but these orbs are basically just, I guess you'd call them like alteration orbs for implicits. There's two big bads, right? New ones. There's the Searing Exarch and the Eater of Worlds. And we'll just call them the red guy and the blue guy. So the red guy and the blue guy have their own set of implicit modifiers that can be added to an item. So it's just like with Shaper and Elder, except instead of adding explicits, which go into like the actual stats of the item, the implicit is the one that is. So you see how this has increased elemental damage? That's the implicit of an opal ring. All opal rings have that implicit. So these things overwrite those implicits, but it pulls from a specific pool, just like how Shaper and Elder and Hunter had their own special modifiers. And these are all orbs that basically serve to mess with influenced gear from these two types. Like there's adds 38 to 72 fire damage to spells. That's probably the Searing Exarch's implicit. And then enemies cannot regenerate life within a radius is probably the Eater of Worlds implicit. And you can use these orbs to mess with them. The nice thing to me about this system is that, like they talked about this on the stream, you can interact with your gear way easier early on. So like when you're in map progression and you're just hitting your Atlas for the first time and you're just starting to fight like the influenced maps of these two, you can kind of use them as they drop. Like you could sell them on trade probably, but it's not a big deal if you just slap it on an item. It's gonna, especially if your item doesn't have an implicit. Lots of rares don't have like meaningful implicit items or affixes, so you can just throw it on there and see what happens. And if you have a really good rare, you can't like brick a rare item with these. All you can do is reroll the implicit, and if you mess it up, you can just buy more reroll implicit things. So to that end, it feels a little bit safer, right? Most of the ways you can craft in PoE up until now, you've been able to brick an item pretty easily. Whether you ruin an affix, you forget to roll prefixes cannot be changed, scour it, and suddenly your item's ruined. You hit a Maven's orb and it goes wrong and the item's just bricked. These things don't have that element to them. You can never really brick an item. And I like that. It just makes them like lower risk. It might still be expensive to like really target a high tier affix, because they kind of use the Maven's orb mechanic where the highest tier you can apply yourself is tier 4, right? But this thing will push one up to tier 5 and push the other one down to tier 3 if there's both of them, right? And you can go all the way up to 6, but it's random, kind of like with the Maven Orb, where you don't get to pick. So there's RNG in it still, like most PoE crafting, but you can't blow up your stuff. So this would be a really nice change, I think. Don't be afraid to use this stuff early on. The other thing about Maven too, they buffed her uniques. Now they didn't buff Viridi's Veil. I think that's fair because Viridi's was probably the best item she had. But they did buff everything else basically. And the Arn's Anguish buff is pretty good. Arn's Anguish was kind of like a budget belt to use before Coward's Legacy. I didn't use it a whole lot because it turns your endurance charges into brutal charges. And the brutal charges give you like 3% chance to deal triple damage. So each one of them is basically 9% more damage. But you lose all of the defensive benefits of endurance charges. Well, now this gives you +1 max endurance charges, so you will be able to get another 9% more damage basically. The thing about it is that this buff, it doesn't really affect freezing pulse totems that much because we didn't generate endurance, right? We just had minimum. This is giving +1 maximum. So it's good if you have some kind of generation. Not amazing if you're just a Hierophant who gets your endurance charges from Conviction of Power. But still, I think these were warranted buffs. Some of the other stuff down here is pretty minor, like we talked about how Sextants got changed. They made like a new currency item, because you know how you used to be able to like store watchstones that had sextants on them for later. Because of the voice stones, there's only 4 of them. There's no way to like really do that. They made like a new thing that you can like pull up a sextant and store it in that. That's all that's really. There is like a little nice buff to Blight Ravage maps. I think this was needed. I got really lucky. I was like one of the first people in the world to get a Strangle Gasp last league. But after that, that was the very first one I ran. Every Blight Ravage map I ran after that was garbage returns, no matter how I juiced it. So getting a doubled bonus on the quantity modifiers affecting the Blight chests. It used to be 20 and now it's 40. That'll probably help. So the Divination card change, this is a side effect of the maps changing and the fact that a bunch of itemization changes happened, right? So they don't want to have to, mess with the maps every time, because there's a bunch of div cards that used to give like a specific map. Now they just give like a specific tier of map, which is fine. And they changed some of the drop pools for some div cards to have like multiple maps, so that when they're doing this map cycling, they don't have to come back, change it again. Now it'll just drop in multiple places. And then one of the bigger changes, the removal of prophecy. We've known about this for a long time. They broadcast this one way before even the manifesto. The most relevant change to this is for Siege Ballista, which uses a faded quiver, Fury's Demise. And they didn't remove it or anything. It's just going to be a random drop from map bosses. So we don't really know what the drop rate is going to look like, obviously, but I would be really surprised if that turned out to be a super rare item. I would expect it to be at least as available, if not cheaper than it used to be, but hard to say. It's something we're just going to have to find out, unfortunately. And if you're concerned about it, maybe don't start Siege Ballista and just League Start Freezing Pulse, or League Start whatever you want, and just like go switch into Siege Ballista after it's like kind of settled down and we know how expensive something like that would be. The other big item that's been relevant before is Adziri's Reflection. That is, they deleted the like mirror version of that item, and now it's just Reflection, and it drops from Uber Adziri. So this item, in theory, should get more common, because the Divination card that used to give the Prophecy just gives the shield now. So this stack just gives you a Reflection, and it could just drop from Uber Adziri. What the drop rate from Uber Adziri looks like, and if they change the drop rate of Beauty Through Death, we don't know. But in theory, I would expect the price of that shield to go down. And that may be relevant because if we find a helmet or like, let's say implicit modifiers from the new crafting are so good in helmet that we actually want to run reflection and we want to get that ring slot back too, maybe it's relevant, you know? It's hard to say without seeing all the itemization in the patch, which we just don't have access to yet, but it could be relevant, and hopefully it becomes cheaper. This betrayal change, I talked about this during the live stream, like right after the live stream when this came out, is one of my favorite changes. So currently, if you set up your board and you're running like research and intervention, right, which is usually what most people do, it's sometimes annoying to cycle research in particular because the leader and the one guy you have in research will both be rank 3. And so the leader will just never show up because they're the same rank and they never have to. And so what they've done is they've changed it so that the leaders can now join as long as there's just 3 ranks in the job, instead of like not showing up if there wasn't somebody lower or higher than them. This will just make it so much easier. There's no thinking now about like having to make trust lines between all the people that are over in like the other 2 safe houses. It's not nearly as important because the leader can just show up by themselves or show up alongside the other rank 3 guy. It's going to make it so much easier. So I'm going to be burning tons of Betrayal this league. And we got some Act 2. Supposedly the Act 2 buff is not as thorough as the Act 1 buff. But the Act 1 buff, I think, was a little spooky. So we'll have to see. Like, you know, Oak that has definitely caused people problems recently. Hopefully we don't see too large of a buff on Oak. Nobody's going to be able to kill him anymore. This one kind of went under the radar for most people, but they added some new rare and monster modifiers. A lot of these modifiers, these are basically like, you can sometimes read these as headhunter buffs, right? A lot of these are caster oriented, and traditionally headhunter has not really been as good for spellcasters as it has been for physical builds, especially like physical attack builds. And with these, you know, you're going to get a lot more extra damage and cast speed and spell damage and more extra lightning damage. All these things are very relevant to spellcasters. So it might be more worth thinking about running Headhunter for map clearing on something like a spell totem build than it used to be. We'll have to check that out, see how serious it is. And then one of the other big changes, we talked about this in the balance manifesto. Not much has changed since the manifesto for these notes, so we won't spend too long on it, but we should talk about what's new here, which is a couple things. The first is on Ice Spear. If you remember, I was kind of annoyed when they said this line when they were talking about Ice Spear giving them improvements to make them better skills, and I was like, well, they actually gave Flame Blast and Lightning Tendrils new functionality, but they didn't say anything about Ice Spear. So, in the actual patch notes, it does say the spread of Ice Spear projectiles has been reduced, meaning you no longer have to aim far away from your character in order for the projectiles to fire straight. This could be a very good buff to Ice Spear, because one of the problems is that it's very finicky about where you put your totem, right? Because if it's too close, they hit in phase 1 instead of phase 2, and if you're not crit capped, you lose a bunch of crit chance or crit damage. And then if you put it too far away, a bunch of the projectiles would miss, because by the time it got to them, they'd spread out a bunch. So I'm hoping that this Ice Spear change means that it's almost like a fixed spread, right? Where it's like a column, whether they're close or far, and they just all go in a straight line. That's what I'm hoping for. We'll have to see. If it's not much of a change, we might use Creeping Frost for single target and Freezing Pulse instead of Ice Spear. Creeping Frost got the exact same damage buff as Ice Spear did. It's almost on the nose at 50%, both in base damage and effectiveness. What Ice Spear got? Well, actually, Ice Spear got a slightly more effectiveness of added damage compared to Creeping Frost. So, like, Ice Spear in theory should do more damage, but Creeping Frost is much easier to use. You just like put the totem right on top of them, and it it technically doesn't shotgun as it travels, but it shotguns when it hits the ground. And so when you put the totem on top of them, the totem just shoots the ground right in front of it, basically. All the projectiles explode right in front of it. And so it does very, very good single target that way. I would say almost comparable to Ice Spear, but without any of the finickiness. So we'll try Ice Spear in the new patch. I may just wind up replacing this recommendation with Creeping Frost. But if this is a much bigger buff than it reads, then maybe we just stick with Ice Spear. I'm not sure. There is also a change to Wave of Conviction here, which is good. It's not quite 50%, closer to like 47, but we just wanted to get the regular buff, because that means that our campaign progression is slightly better than it used to be, right? Because we're gaining more damage than we're losing on the spell totem change, and we were never using Soul Mantle in the campaign with a Holy Flame Totem build. Holy Flame Totem went up by like a little over 10% at the high end. Because it's in like the gem curve, I would say Holy Flame Totem will probably do about 5% more damage during the campaign on average, and then Wave of Conviction will do more. The Holy Flame Totem setup already cooks the campaign, so I'm pretty happy to see that. And then everything else here, I think, was part of the Balance Manifesto. I don't think anything else new really took place here. We'll have to see. I'm not certain. I haven't done like any of the napkin math on if any of these like bow itemization changes are really that relevant to Siege Ballista. Like, I think it's a death bow that Iron Commander is. But we weren't really scaling off the physical damage of the bow. So I don't think most of these changes are really gonna matter too much for Iron Commander specifically. But one thing it might do is make leveling with some kind of bow skill, you know, Explosive Arrow, Ballista is sounding very popular. But any of, like, even the way that I leveled in 3.16, although Toxic Rain got nerfed, but any kind of bow skill into Ballista probably will feel better at the low end, because bows just got a lot stronger affixes than they used to. They roll like generic two-hand instead of their own little bow pool. We'll have to see. I still don't know if I would like blanket recommend Siege Ballista as a starter for people that aren't sure, right? Because leveling it is definitely not as easy as it is with Freezing Pulse, and the early progression of Freezing Pulse is like still pretty trivial, even in this patch. Like if you didn't watch the Balance Manifesto video, the Freezing Pulse build is ultimately going to do slightly more damage than it used to, even with the Soul Mantle nerf. It's just going to lose 2 projectiles, and it means you got to buy a Rain of Splinters. But you would have to buy a Rain of Splinters with Siege Ballista too anyway. So you can't really get around that. And you know you'll have an easier time, I think, getting to that transition point with Holy Flame Totem, with the much stronger like full spell totem tree. So I don't know. We'll have to see if it solves the early game enough that that's no longer a concern. Oh, one of the other neat changes here too is that mark skills are now permanent. So you can just cast them once on a boss and that's it, which is really nice. There's also like a new mark on hit support gem. I don't think we would use this personally, but it is an option there if you want like a hex touch for Sniper's Mark. I think everything else here was part of the Balance Manifesto that is relevant. Divine Blessing. Yeah, I don't think anything else here is super important. So the TLDR is that when PoE comes out, I'll update both builds with what I know. Like I'm going to update Freezing Pulse on the assumption that the new Eternal Blessing support gem can't be used with an Essence Worm. And if it can, great, I'll update that after the launch, but we don't know that. But I think it'll be an upgrade to get the ring slot back. And then Siege Ballista really is not changing. If you played Siege Ballista in 3.16, I don't know why you would have any, reservations about playing it in 3.17. It's the same build. It's going to do the same damage. My only concern with either build right now is that so many of the hardcore streamers are recommending people play Explosive Arrow Ballista. And I don't know why, but a lot of the trade, like the softcore trade players, they get their league starters from the hardcore, like soul self-found people sometimes. Like even Darky, when so many people went Toxic Rain Champion, was like, don't play that build in softcore trade, but a lot of people did. And I think that's going to happen again with this Explosive Arrow Ballista build. So the problem with that is that build is obviously going to use Rain of Splinters too. And it might be hard to acquire Rain of Splinters in the first few days. Or at least expensive. I don't know how common Rain of Splinters will be made in the new patch, but I would assume it won't be cheap. So if you want to go fast, I would recommend making Rain of Splinters your first purchase for either build. And if you aren't going that fast, I would maybe consider starting Freezing Pulse, because you can stay Holy Flame Totem, you know, into yellows totally easily. I think you won't notice like any big deal being Holy Flame Totem in yellow. So that's about all I have to say about it for now. I will update both builds. I will probably make one video this league for both of those, because I don't want to make like hour-long videos for both of them. So we'll probably just do one league start video with both updates whenever POB updates, and I have time to update them in full and have the forum guide updated. So I would expect that usually POB doesn't update for a couple of days after the gem reveal at like the soonest. We'll have to see, but I would not expect that to show up until pretty close to league start itself. I'm pretty excited. To me, this league reminds me so much of Ritual with this huge Atlas update, and Ritual was by far my favorite patch in a long time. I'm really looking forward to just grinding out the Atlas, making a giant passive skill tree, and then just farming my heart out. I think I'll probably league start Freezing Pulse this league. A lot of people seem to think that the build is dead. I don't think the build is dead for sure. At least it's certainly not any more dead than it is right now. Like if you played it in 3.16, it's probably slightly better than it was in 3.16. It's just quality of life is questionable, in the sense that like 3 projectiles is actually not a big deal. It really isn't. I've been playing around a little bit on standard with just a Rain of Splinters, and it's like it kind of doesn't matter later on. You know, it's really not that big of a deal. And I really don't mind using Creeping Frost as single target. I get annoyed. That was actually one of the bigger reasons I didn't league start in 3.16, is because I personally get annoyed with Ice Spear. It's obviously a good spell, it's a good single target swap, but I get annoyed with it because of the really finicky positioning. And Creeping Frost is actually just kind of solves that. I can just park my totem on top of the guy, and if the boss moves, I just put the totem on him again. And it actually kind of synergizes with the totem taunt in Mastery, right? You just keep summoning on top of the guy, and they keep taunted, and you do a lot of damage. So either way, if Ice Spear is buffed and that's more usable now, or if I just gotta use Creeping Frost, I'll probably be happy either way. I think we'll still be able to do pretty competent single target. I don't think the build is going to be massively better than it was in 3.16 for sure, regardless of what happens in the itemization. So like as a Simulacrum 30 wave farmer, I don't think I'd use either build for that. But I think all the lanes that it was already good at, I think being an all-rounder, both of them are still very good. Siege Ballista probably a little bit slower to get there, but maybe a more safe high-end boss or two. So if you're planning on doing a lot of target farming on these two for these, you know, super dank chase items, maybe Siege Ballista should be more your target. But we'll find out together, I think. As always, I'm going to be streaming a ton at League Start. So you can find me at twitch.tv/WallachTV starting on Friday, I'm assuming. Feel free to subscribe if you like the videos. I will see you again whenever PoB updates and I have time to update both the builds. Hopefully sometime soon and not like the day before League Start. Anyway, until next time, peace.